Sitting several rows behind them, I could clearly see my supervisor Roger and his wife Doreen, where they were sitting in the front pew. They were surrounded by Doreen's family as we gave thanks for the life of her father, who had just passed away a couple of days ago. And let's call him Jim, just because I don't remember his actual name. The service was in a small rural town north of Belfast in a Free Methodist congregation. The night before, Roger had gone on a rant to me about the theology of the Free Methodist denomination, and he fumed and said this funeral was not going to be anything that would be comforting. It was going to be about saving souls, and he went on to say that the theology was going to be so problematic that it was going to make his skin crawl. He said that I should expect that the pastor would say something about having a true relationship with Jesus Christ, and that if I didn't, I was sure never to see my loved ones again. I was not disappointed. "You will see your beloved Jim again," the preacher boomed in a voice that was far more threatening than comforting, "if and only if you turn from your sinful ways, you confess your sins, and can you commit your heart to Jesus Christ. If you don't, you are separating yourself from Jim for all of eternity, and you are separating yourself from all whom you love and from God." I cringed. And I seethed in silence. From my vantage point, a couple rows back, I could see Roger saying something to Doreen, and at that point, I knew his body language well enough to see that he was really irritated. But the poor theology didn't end with that one line. There was a lengthy diatribe on how we all had to turn our hearts away from the devil and turn to Jesus Christ. And yes, of course, I was damned for being gay, going straight to hell. Got it. And that we needed to be in a right relationship. So, I wasn't, in order to see our dearly departed loved ones again. And at some point in there, he threw in the best little bit of all. He said, "Human beings are sinful right from the time that they are born. Any parent would know that you could see in a little infant just how sinful they are right out of the womb." It was, in a word, disgusting. It was certainly not the kind of thing that you would say to someone in the midst of their grieving if you wanted to comfort them. Certainly not something that you would say to someone to provide pastoral care. Looking back on it now, hindsight being 2020 and all, there is a line from a TV show that pops into my head. And Lauren and I went back and forth about this for quite some time this morning, about whether it was from MASH or from The West Wing, and neither of us can quite remember. But the line goes like this. There are two people, and one of them starts saying something that, you wouldn't want said in public, something that is hurtful and maybe a little bit prejudiced or a lot prejudiced or just disrespectful, rude, and altogether something you shouldn't say. And so the other character says, "You don't say." But the one who's speaking just keeps going on. And so the second character says a little bit more forcefully, "You don't say." And the guy just keeps going on, continuing as if he's totally missed the subtle subtext there. And this guy just continues on with his hurtful, hateful words. And so the second person says, "No, you really don't say." Clearly communicating that the words coming out of that first person's mouth were something that shouldn't be said at all. And that person better stop talking. Every time I think about that funeral, every time I'm at a funeral that's even remotely like it, those are the words that come to my mind. You don't say. You don't say. No, you really don't say. And it's honestly what I find myself saying to Job's friends every time I read this troubled and troubling narrative. As one of my supervisors put it when I was doing my chaplaincy training, Job's friends are a prime example of what not to do when you are providing pastoral care. To be clear, they actually do start off doing exactly what you should do. For 7 days and 7 nights, they say absolutely nothing, and they sit in silence with Job because they see the depth of his agony. But then they make the terrible mistake of opening their mouths. And they are terrible, just awful at providing comfort. Take Eliphaz, for example. He's the one that we hear from in our middle passage for this morning. Now, Job has just cursed the day that he was born because he is in such deep pain. His 10 children have been killed. He is covered from head to toe in very, very painful sores. He has lost all of his worldly possessions. It is trauma after trauma, tragedy after tragedy. And even if we argue, as I would, that he is not actually all that upright or righteous because he is incredibly wealthy and doesn't seem to do anything to abolish the practice of slavery. Remember, he owned a lot of slaves. Or to close the wealth gap between the rich and the poor. Even if we say that about him, I can't imagine any of us arguing that he deserved this, or that God would do this to him, or that this is what justice looks like in the restorative, God-centered, loving sense of the word. So it's really not a good sign when Eliphaz opens his mouth and starts off with, "If one ventures a word with you, will you be offended?" It's kind of like when someone says to you, "No offense, but..." You can rest assured that when someone says that, the next words out of their mouth are probably going to be offensive to you, right? You kind of know that's coming. But Eliphaz really crosses the line in my book. Pay close attention to these words. "Think now, who that was innocent ever perished? Or were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of God's anger they are consumed." At first glance, maybe, this doesn't seem so bad. But then take a second. Consider who's perished in this story. It's Job's sons and daughters. And then consider how they perished. It was by a strong wind blowing down the house that they were in, crushing them to death. And then consider what you know of Hebrew, that breath and wind are often the same word. Now think again about Eliphaz's words. He said, the innocent do not perish. Who that was innocent ever perished? And by the breath of God, by a wind from God, they are killed. So what Eliphaz is really saying here, at least as some commentators believe, is that Eliphaz is talking about Job's children, and he's saying, your kids got what they deserved, Job. They were not innocent, and so God killed them with a blast of wind. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that your child has died? And then a close friend, your best friend maybe, saying, well, God did this. God did this to them because they were guilty of something. I'm not sure what, but they were guilty, and so they deserved to die. It's their own fault. You don't say. No, you really don't say. we can't conceive of saying something so heinous and so heartless, can we? And yet on Thursday morning, when I sat down to write this sermon, Ohio Senator Steve Huffman had just made headline news in the Washington Post for saying, and I quote, African Americans or the colored population maybe have been disproportionately affected by the novel coronavirus pandemic because they do not wash their hands as well as other groups. Which, quite aside from being ignorant and racist and hateful, is effectively saying your sons, your daughters, your wives, your husbands, your brothers, your sisters, your mothers, your fathers, they are all dying because of something they weren't doing right. They are dying and it is their fault. And yet, I've heard people say, well, if George Floyd hadn't been using a counterfeit bill, he wouldn't have been killed by police. Quite aside from the fact that most people who use counterfeit bills never know that they even have them, these people are saying that Mr. Floyd deserved to be lynched because maybe he was committing fraud. It was his own fault. And yet, over the years, we've heard it time and time and time again. Eric Garner wouldn't have been killed if he hadn't illegally been selling cigarettes. I would love to know when that became a capital offense in our country. Michael Brown wouldn't have died if he hadn't run from the cops. Freddie Gray would still be alive if he hadn't had a knife tucked into his pocket and if he hadn't run when police officers who weren't going to stop him made eye contact with him. Ahmaud Arbery wouldn't have died if he hadn't looked like a robbery or burglary suspect. 12-year-old Tamir Rice wouldn't have been killed by police if he hadn't been playing with a toy gun. Breonna Taylor would still be alive if she and her boyfriend hadn't gotten startled when police battered down her door with a battering ram in the middle of the night. Your daughter would still be alive if she hadn't looked violent. Your son would still be alive if he hadn't looked like a criminal. It's their own fault. Because being black in this country is synonymous with being violent or being a criminal or being guilty. Being black in this country is a capital offense. No judge, no jury, no assumption of innocence until proven guilty required. Do we hear these as the heinous, heartless words of Eliphaz? Do we hear that that's what they are? And what about commentary on the riots? What about commentary on the looting? Those people are destroying their own communities. Those people are just thieves. Those people are acting like animals. Those people. Do we hear what they're saying? Do we hear what we're saying? We're saying that our brothers and our sisters are less than human. We're saying that even though we have been killing our neighbors' children, and even though they have never gotten justice for it, they do not get to be angry at all. They do not get to cry out for justice. We're saying that we're not comfortable with the way that our brothers and our sisters are expressing their feelings of anger and injustice, their rage, their grief, their trauma. So they need to stop so that we can feel better. Do we hear that these are the heinous, heartless words of Eliphaz? Do we hear it? And then do we hear what our brothers and our sisters of color are really trying to say? One writer said that as a part of the community that surrounded the CVS on Penn and North Avenue, the one that burned in 2015, when he saw it in flames, he saw it as an honest, legitimate expression of anger. Anger at living in a community where too often people have to choose between buying food or turning on the heat and buying the prescriptions that could save their lives. Anger at the oppression of an economic system that makes the poor poorer and the rich richer, a system from which big corporations like CVS benefit. Do we hear the cry for justice as we see the CVS burning? Do we hear the Spirit's voice calling to us through it, just as God called to Moses through the burning bush? Job's friends had it right for those first 7 days and 7 nights. They didn't know what he had been through. They didn't know what he had experienced. They had never been through anything like that themselves. And so they just sat and listened. In our nation, there are a lot of people who are acting like Eliphaz after he opens his mouth right now. They've blown way past the listening stage and right into talking, often just to make themselves feel a little bit more comfortable. Perhaps that's even some of us. Perhaps some of us are even taking a page out of Eliphaz's book. I know that I am tempted to from time to time. How are we responding? How are we responding to the Eliphaz that we hear out in the world? How are we responding to the voice of Eliphaz that we hear within ourselves? Do we agree on some level? Do we listen in silence? Or do we actually use our voice to say, "You don't say. You don't say. No, you really don't say." If we want to see any real change rise up from the ashes of these riots and uprisings, then we need to stop reading at Job chapter 2. We need to stop reading right at that spot where Job's friends stop listening. We don't go any further to where they stop talking. Just let's end with they listened for 7 days and 7 nights because they saw his suffering. We need to listen to our brothers and our sisters, even if it makes us uncomfortable, especially if it makes us uncomfortable. We need to listen to their words, we need to listen to their actions, and we need to listen without opening our mouths to justify ourselves. We need to watch and take it in without feeling the need to be comfortable. We need to listen so that we understand and so that we might not be heartless and say heinous things or do heinous things or be complicit with systems that remain heinous. We need to listen. We need to sit with those who are traumatized, those who are grieving, those who are suffering. And we also need to listen hard to those people who make us feel comfortable and warm and cozy, because we need to hear the Eliphaz in their words. And we need to know that that is Eliphaz. And then we need to step even farther outside of what's comfortable. And to those people who make us feel comfortable, we need to say, no, you really don't say. And if we truly want to see godly change, a change that we could agree is for the better, come out of this, then we also need to step outside of what's comfortable and use our voices as allies alongside those who are speaking and crying out for justice as they say, no, you really don't say. In doing this, we join in Christ's work. In doing this, we meet God at the burning bush or the burning CVS. In doing this, we follow the Spirit's call out into the world. And it is only by doing this that we can even begin to hope to work with God in creating that kingdom where all lives matter and where all people are seen as worthy, where all bodies are seen as beautiful, and where all lives are regarded as sacred, as gifts from God, as beloved, as children. In this, we find ourselves Christian who actually love. So let's do this.